If it were true that our lending practices were more responsible than the Americans, why is it that in 1990 Australian household debt compared to GDP was half the level of America, and now in 2010 and subsequently we have a ratio of household debt to GDP that's about 10% higher than the Americans? So we've gone from less debt per head to more debt per head, and yet they're supposed to be irresponsible and we're responsible. The way that there is a difference is that the Americans did a large part of what's called originate and distribute lending. So a particular mortgage originator would produce a number of mortgages, would then bundle those into a security, sell those security through a merchant bank, and not have any consequences if the mortgages went bad. So they didn't care whether you had any capacity to repay the debt. So it was quite okay to go and choose Ma and Pa Kettle and get them to borrow a ridiculous amount of money, give them 120% of the cost of the property they wanted to buy, and they'd buy it with 100% of the debt, furnish it with 5%, pay the first few repayments with the remainder, and then go bankrupt. But that's okay, you'd sold the mortgage by that stage and somebody else wore the consequences of doing it. Yes, that's true, that was more irresponsible than we got in Australia, because here, largely, though we did have some originate and redistribute here, most of the loans were originated by the banks or the building societies and kept on their own books. Therefore, anything went wrong, they carry the consequences. And their argument is that makes us more responsible. What it made them, in my opinion, is a different form of predator. Because if you look at what the Americans were doing, I make an analogy between the lions on the African plains and the wildebeest, and they chased down the weak and the infirm wildebeest and ate them. That's the end of them. The rest of the herd gets away. So the distribution of debt was down towards the bottom end of the pyramid in America, and when they were wiped out, you wiped out people who didn't have any real capacity to borrow anyway, and therefore if they can't spend anymore, it doesn't really matter as much. In Australia, what the banks did was target the lending so that the amount of money a borrower had left over after servicing the mortgage put them above the poverty line, so long as interest rates didn't increase by more than 2%. And what that really means is they've saturated the debt through the entire society much more broadly than America and put a larger debt load on the total population than in America, and that makes them more like tsetse flies rather than lions on the wildebeest. They've infected the whole herd's sick with debt, and the whole herd therefore has a lower capacity to spend, which is why, apart from online sales, one reason Jerry Norman is complaining about retail performances and all the retailers are suffering right now, we have made it very difficult for the whole housing sector, household sector, to be able to consume, because the debt is distributed very widely through the whole population. So it's a more intelligent form of predation, but it's still predation, and it's been more effective than the Americans. So I'd call them more effective, but I wouldn't call them more responsible, because the rates have gone up by more than 2%. If you go back to the bottom of what we think was the bottom of the global financial crisis in Australia, roughly 30% of the mortgages that now exist were written in that period. Now, not all of them would have been done to the stage where people were on the borderline with a 2% increase in interest rates, but a substantial proportion of them would have been. So anybody who took out a mortgage back then in that situation where they had a high loan-to-valuation ratio, certainly all the first-home buyers who got sucked in by the grant, they would have gone from being just above the poverty line to on it or below, with that 2% plus increase in rates since that period. So therefore they can't afford to consume. And you have people living in a palace in poverty.